Well, earlier today, I spoke to Johnbosco Nwogbo, lead campaigner at We Own It, an organisation which promotes the public ownership of key national utilities. And I began by asking why there is so much critique surrounding the government's latest plan for water pollution.
For most people, it's because it's an insane plan. And of course, part of the reason why I chose the word insane is that we tend to define insane as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result every time. The government has been doing exactly what they've promised or they've announced today that they're going to do. And it's just not worked. Regulation has utterly and completely failed to deal with the problem of sewage being thrown into our rivers and seas by these private water companies who have no incentive at all to do the right thing for our water system.
Yeah, I wanted to ask particularly about this idea of fines in the government's new plan that they've outlined. Then supposedly the water companies that breach regulations will be hit with more fines. But is it that it would actually just be more profitable for these water companies to pay up these fines and continue with what they're doing?
Yes, it will. I mean, obviously, we don't know exactly what the government means by more fines. We've seen today Theresa Coffey suggesting that they may be forced to pay quote unquote unlimited fines. So we don't know exactly what the government, what unlimited fines look like for the government. What we do know though is that so far the government fines these companies at such a rate that paying the fine is the smart business choice for them, as opposed to actually trying to fix our infrastructure, to invest in the infrastructure, to make sure that they're not throwing sewage into our rivers on average over 800 times a day, at least in the last year. We know that we're pouring sewage into rivers and seas even more times last year than they're doing this year. So, in essence, the government's policy thus far um, incentivizes private water companies not to invest in our water infrastructure. Obviously, we know that if the water was in public ownership, we would be investing a lot more in the infrastructure. And this is not theory. Scotland's water is in public ownership. Scotland Water is the most trusted public utility in the entirety of the United Kingdom. They've invested about £72 per Scottish family more than the English water companies have invested in our water infrastructure. If the English water companies invested at about the same rate, by now they would have invested about £28 billion more than they did invest in our water system. So it's clear that public ownership would actually bring about the kind of investment in our water system that we need to deal with this problem.
At the moment, where do the profits from England's privatised water systems go?
At the moment, about 72% of our water system in England is owned by foreign companies, foreign public sovereign wealth funds, and private equity investors, which is really interesting because obviously sovereign wealth funds are in effect public ownership by another term, by another word, but public ownership obviously by another country. So we have Abu Dhabi owning parts of, I believe, Seven Water. We have the Chinese Sovereign Wealth Fund. We have the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund. And we have a few others that own shares in our water companies. And of course, we have BlackRock, very notoriously, owning shares in some of our water companies. It's incredible that if you look at the model for the water system in England, it's not your typical privatization model, really. Usually, the idea is, well, how do you make profit when you run a business? You bring down your costs, you try and bring in as much revenue as you can. And the difference between your costs and your revenues are your profits. And that's how you make profits. But the fact that our water system in England is mainly run by private equity companies that essentially make money not by kind of this interplay between profits, between costs and revenue, but by financial engineering and restructuring the finances of companies, um, kind of tells us all we need to know about why this system is not working. It's not working because its primary goal at the moment is to make money for companies across the world. And we're not suggesting, of course, that our water system is much better held by British private companies. They have exactly the same interests. And in fact, some of our water is already controlled by British private companies. And the problem is not going to be solved by some kind of, if you like, nationalistic capitalism around our water. It will be solved by taking the water system into public ownership and, even more importantly, running it with an ethos of public service as opposed to running it for the profits of companies and countries across the world.
Labour have mooted setting up a publicly owned energy firm, I think similar to the sort of model that is present currently in Wales with their water supply. If this was applied to our water system, does that go far enough, do you think?
I don't think so at all. Obviously, England and Wales, in terms of water, are very different. Wales is, of course, very small compared to England. And because of the way water infrastructure operates, it's impossible to create an equivalent of Great British Energy, right? In the energy sector, it's possible for the government to create a company that it uses to kind of influence the market and move it in the right direction. And we think that Great British Energy is a move in the right direction, although it's not 100% of what we would like to see. So I think that Great British Energy works in energy. It might work, something to that effect might work for water in Wales because of the size of the country at play. But here in England, you don't have a choice who you buy your water from. Essentially, the water companies that provide water to families and households and businesses across the different parts of England have a total monopoly, not just because they're the only people that have the licenses to provide water in those areas, but because we just have a particular set infrastructure to distribute water in those areas. So it just would not work in water. What would work in water is taking the water system totally into public ownership. At the moment, actually, what's really interesting is that to take our water system into public ownership, we need to give the water companies 25 years warning before we can do that. That is utterly ridiculous. And of course, we totally understand when people talk about how taking the system back to centrally controlled body might not work. We are totally in support of some kind of municipalization of the ownership of our water systems. It's working in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in other parts of Europe. So, I mean, there is really no reason whatsoever not to take our water into public ownership.
What is the public support for renationalising the water supplies like at the moment? And is it just political will that isn't there when it comes to an obstacle to doing that?
I would say that it's the lack of political will at the moment. According to our last poll from last year, late last year, which was incidentally the largest poll that has been done on the subject in terms of the sample of people that were polled, 69% of the public, including a majority of conservative voters, support taking our water into public ownership. I totally understand. Well, I suppose I should say I understand to some extent. Keir Starmer is nervous about making funding commitments around water because, of course, I imagine that it's still ringing very much in their ears. How the Tory press will say that they are going to be costing the exchequer £150 billion to take back water companies. But the reality is that we could take back these water companies much more cheaply than has been mooted around the mainstream press. A parliament would set the price of the shares of these companies and buy it at a fair market price. That is the right way to do it for energy. That's the right way to do it for water. And we don't think at all that there would be any cost. In fact, I think given the popularity of the policy, the Labour Party would stand to benefit enormously from doing something serious and not at all radical. At this point, taking water into public ownership would be the pragmatic thing to do because it's what would work. We've tried literally everything else, and it's clearly not working because the incentive structure is all messed up.
Thanks to Johnbosco for that very in-depth and comprehensive interview.